Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives. We look at the intersection between social justice and the criminal legal system, and we discuss critical questions about how the system works, its impact with on social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are made to improve the lives of everyone that's impacted or affected by it. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about both sides of the bars, and we ask you to join us and share your comments on Twitter at the Fortune SOC. Today's title of the show is called The Color of Justice: Racial and Ethnic Disparity in State Prisons. Going to prison is really a major life-altering event that creates obstacles to building stable lives in the community, such as gaining employment and finding safe housing after release. Imprisonment also reduces lifetime earnings and negatively affects life outcomes among children of incarcerated parents. These are individual level consequences. However, there are also societal level consequences. Those consequences are high levels of imprisonment in communities, which cause high crime rates and neighborhood deterioration, thus fueling greater disparities. According to a report that was released in October by the Sentencing Project, a Washington, D.C.-based advocacy center dedicated to changing the way Americans think about crime and punishment, this cycle is felt disproportionately by people who are Black. It is clear, and I quote, says the report, that the outcome of mass incarceration today has not occurred by happenstance, but has been designed through policies created by a dominant white culture that insists on the suppression of others. Today's guest is the author of that report, Dr. Ashley Nellis, PhD. Ashley's background is in analyzing criminal justice policies and practices, racial disparities, youth justice, and long-term imprisonment. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and on National Public Radio. Dr. Nellis, thank you so much for joining us here today on Both Sides of the Bars. How are you doing?
Good, thank you for having me.
We really appreciate this report that you've written, and we obviously want to talk about it today. And before I go into some of the questions, I know you've been doing this work for quite some time now. It's a passion of yours. But what has drawn you to this work in examining this issue?
Thanks. That's a great question. For me, it's a real interest in seeing a criminal justice system that is as protective of the rights of white people and Black people and people who are Latinx equally and across the board. The system that we have today is not that way, and for me, that level of disparity that we find is, truly, unacceptable, particularly this late in the stage of our, progression along racial justice.
Absolutely. And so given that, given the dominant white culture's history of enslaving Black people and the associations between slavery and disparate incarceration of Black people, do you think there are ways to correct the justice system so that it is fair and viewed as fair?
I do. I think that, we have not made nearly enough progress in this regard, and the findings of this report are almost identical to the findings of our report about 4 years ago. And in the interim, a lot has happened. We've had the murder of George Floyd and a number of demonstrations of unrest and racial reckoning. But, I think it's really, where we see the disparities the most persistent is in the criminal legal system. And so I think there's momentum right now, but I think that it's too slow. The changes that we're seeing are really too slow.
Absolutely. And, from this research, and I read the report, and it's really a seminal work, Dr. Nellis, and I really applaud you for your efforts in examining this issue because it's so important. But what surprises you in your data findings from this report?
I think, what is so surprising about the data is where the disparity is. I think
Mhm.
most Americans would assume that the racial disparity is the worst in prisons in the South. Um, but in fact, the disparity is actually the worst in prisons in the North and in the East side of the country. And that is because of two things. One, a high incarceration of Black people, but also a low incarceration of white people. And what that suggests is that we have a way of diverting white people from the criminal legal system that is used more frequently in the north and the east sides of the country, but is not being used for African Americans. And in the South, incarceration is sort of the go-to tool for everybody. So the disparities are lower, but we have more people who are imprisoned.
And so you conducted a report in 2016, Dr. Nellis. What has changed in the landscape since that report and time?
Since that time, we've had a major shift in our politics. We've had a president who was outwardly racist and encouraged racial violence. That's former President Trump. And then we also had the murder of George Floyd and several other prominently, media sensationalized murders that
Breonna
were
Taylor, others.
all of those.
Right.
Of course, these types of murders were always happening, but
Mhm.
now they were on the news quite a bit all of a sudden, as if this was a sort of a new phenomenon, even though this kind of racial violence goes all the way back to Rodney King and before that.
Right.
But even so, it got people off their couches and into the streets, even during a pandemic, and caused a lot of outrage. We have not seen a lot of change in the legislature as a result, but the public is more aware. And there is, always for every advocacy and activist movement, there is a public education component. And so there is more of a knowledge by the American public about the racial disparities that we have. You know, criminal legal system is where I focus, but of course across all sorts of systems.
And when you think about systems, you think about disparity in and of itself. Dr. Nellis, which states lead the country in disparity?
So when you look at the racial disparity, the comparison between the Black figure per 100,000 residents in that state versus the white figure per 100,000 residents in that state gives you a true sense of disparity. And in this regard, New Jersey leads the country, as it did in 2016, where there is a racial disparity, Black to white, of 12.5 to 1. And this is the highest in the nation.
And so
And
when you say 12.5 to 1, Dr. Nellis, so there are 12.5 Black people to 1 that are engaged in the criminal legal system in some way? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that for every 100,000 people, Black people in New Jersey, there's a ratio of 12 to 1.
Got it.
Actually, I'm not explaining that very well. What's an easy way to explain it? Looking at looking at the census data of
Right.
the number of Black people who are in a state versus the number of white people who are in a state. when we compare that in terms of their incarceration and their general population representation,
Mhm.
there's a disparity of 12-1 when it
Got it.
comes to New Jersey, which leads the nation. Behind this is Wisconsin, which has a disparity of almost 12-1. And behind this is Minnesota and shortly Connecticut, Maine, some of these states that you wouldn't normally consider to be the most
Mhm.
racially disparate states. You'd almost think of them as more progressive states in many ways.
Mhm.
But when it comes to the over incarceration of Black people, given their engagement in crime and also their representation in the general population, we see these disparities emerge.
Ah, and so what would it take for lawmakers, Dr. Nellis, right, to take the necessary actions for reforming prison system, right, in some way, right, so that you know it is used as infrequently for whites who commit crime as it is for Black people who commit crime. What do you think some of the things that lawmakers could do or actions they could take?
Sure. I mean, I think this is something that lawmakers grapple with, and they should be taking more robust action. So, some of the things they could do would be a recommendation that we have for a range of reasons, not the least of which is the racial disparity that gets created because of it, which would be the elimination of mandatory minimums across the board. So mandatory minimums became popularized in the 1980s and 90s as a way of removing discretion from judges and placing it in the hands of prosecutors so that prosecutors could know what to charge in order to get the sentence that they wanted to get.
Mhm.
And so a sentence of, let's say, 5 to 10 years is a mandatory minimum of 5 years, and so forth. So, what the implications of this are that Black people have been brought into the system more frequently and punished more severely as a result of mandatory minimums. So, not having to do with their actual engagement in crime, but having to do with the imposition of punishments more heavily targeted toward Black and Brown people than toward white. So, we would recommend eliminating mandatory minimums across the board. Another mandatory that has caused a lot of problems in the criminal legal system is the mandatory transfer of juveniles into the adult system. And
Mhm.
so here, moving youth who are a certain age, who are charged with a certain crime, or who are at the hands of a prosecutor who has the authority to move them into the adult criminal legal system, has resulted in an over incarceration of Black and Brown youth and put them into the adult criminal legal system as if they were adults.
And so when we think about that, Dr. Nellis, what is the relationship between this racial disparity in the criminal legal system and the Nixon administration in the 70s with the war on crime, and followed by that with Ronald Reagan, right? With the extension of that. What is the relationship with all of that stuff?
Well, I think, what started in the 1970s with the prison buildup and the increase of incarceration, so that we now all know that steady increase that began in 1972 and then has gone on until about 2010, referred to as mass incarceration. That started because of a hope that we could remove any sort of ambiguity or discretion from decision makers and move it into just statutory, distinctions of sentences. So, and the root of that was that people were letting offenders, and particularly people of color, off easy. And the idea was to get tough on crime. And the result is that we've had people who have gone to prison and people who are staying in prison for decades and decades longer than they really need to for any public safety benefit. And the overwhelming burden of those policies has fallen on Black and Brown families, communities, and individuals.
And it's interesting, right? Because when we talk about the Nixon era and the war on crime, some argue that there was a thinly veiled kind of racial element in the tone, right, and in the messaging of that. And obviously, from the Nixon era to the Reagan era, the prisons actually doubled in number, right? Hence, we had this notion of mass incarceration. And then there was a crime bill. Dr. Nellis, is there any thoughts or reflection on the crime bill, right, relative to racial disparities in the criminal legal system?
Sure. So it really was, all three of those contributors and more that led to, there being 2.2 million people incarcerated. And I think, the crime bill gets a lot of blame for mass incarceration, but the reality is that it certainly did accelerate mass incarceration, but it started with the war on drugs that Nixon declared in 1972. And so, there was sort of a softening around people's willingness, I suppose, to, be fair and compassionate toward people who broke the law, and instead was this law and order mentality and tone and policy making that led to a complete removal of consideration for individual factors that do lead to crime.
And so, during the Nixon era, and I continue to harken back to that era because some would arguably say that we are seeing some traces of that kind of tone and rhetoric now, particularly in the New York area, right? In terms of fear and the notion of this war on ending like crime and violence, etc. Do you feel, Dr. Nellis, that there's some similar kind of toning and sentiment now that may be akin to what Nixon had lifted up and amplified?
I do. I am troubled by some of the rhetoric coming out of New York and other places, particularly as we are experiencing an uptick in violent crime, murder in particular, and this sort of trigger response to going back to the way we did things in the past, even though we know that those strategies did not work. And what they did was make relations between African Americans and whites even more complicated. And so, we do see language coming out of New York and elsewhere that's like this. I think every time we hear about, the young and violent and sort of remorseless, incorrigible types of language, we're hearkening back to a time that we already know did not work.
Absolutely. And when you think about it, Dr. Nellis, like, what solutions do you propose, right? Because we have an analysis, right? You developed this really powerful report. It's a seminal body of work. But what solution do you propose for ending racial and ethnic disparities in imprisonment?
Sure. So one of the things we can do is and mandatory minimums, and another is to impose racial impact statements, both retrospectively and prospectively. And what these would be like would be similar to an environmental impact statement, where there's a forecasting to the what will happen as a result of a law that's passed. So when we pass a law that will infringe on somebody's community, we try to see what environmental impact that will have, water water, toxic air, things like that. It's required to see how will the community be affected by this particular environmental law. And we propose the same for criminal legal reforms, so that we don't run into the same issues we have before. And instead, we can sort of force an analysis at the front end that allows policymakers to see the impact, the long-term impact of their particular policy on different racial and ethnic groups. We would also take this a step further and require that this policy be made retroactive. So we know certain laws have had a disparate impact. For instance, school zoning laws that put a higher punishment on people who break the law near a school. Of course, that sounds like you're protecting children. But what it really does is it makes the punishment more difficult, more harsh on people who are living in inner cities. And we know that that is more likely to be people who are Black and brown than white people. And so this would force lawmakers to take these analyses into account before they put the law into effect, and to make repair for laws that have already caused disparate outcomes.
And Dr. Nellis, where does restorative justice work factor into all of this, right? And is there a place for some restorative justice work to occur in addressing these disparities?
I do think that there is, and this comes from an understanding that people in our space already have, which is that many victims want to have the relationship healed in some way or another. It causes an enormous strain, a lifelong strain, to have been the victim of a crime. Some people are more willing to engage in restorative justice than others, and that's completely understandable. But it is not fair and accurate to say that all victims, or even most victims, want their perpetrator to be incarcerated for these draconian sentences, because the polling of victims suggests that they don't, that they do want some sort of restoration, that they do want compensation, but that they do not benefit very much from these harsh penalties that have been disproportionately imposed on African American and Latinx people.
And it's interesting that you raised that, right? Because people who are survivors of harm are considered harmed parties, right? As you term survivors. Like you said, the data is out there where invariably many of the harmed persons don't want that kind of punishment for the people that have harmed them in some way, but compensation is one of those things. And the other thing is also healing in some way, right? As a person that's been harmed, because they can now see that I didn't have on my back this notion, I didn't have on my back a letter and something inscribed saying hurt me or harm me. And they just realized in understanding why the person did it to them, right, what motivated them. And it wasn't because of like how they looked or who they were in terms of identity and gender, all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to raise that because I wanted to know if there was a place for restorative justice in doing this kind of work and understanding this notion of disparities in imprisonment. And so, Dr. Nellis, are there any closing thoughts that you'd like to share? Because I'm sure there's much more we can talk about, and your report is really powerful. We encourage people to read it and go to the Sentencing Project's website to obviously be able to look at it. But are there any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with our viewers?
I guess just that, we know that there are sort of these small openings for reform, particularly during legislative sessions, but even public willingness is not always the same. And right now we're in a political cycle where there is more possibility for progressive reform. And, who knows what will come down the road. We all have learned that lesson. And so the time to take action really is always now. And, the system that we have that relies principally on incarceration to lower crime is not one that's used elsewhere around the world. It's very uncommon and unusual for us to go this route. It's not effective. It's very costly, and it has harmed entire generations now. And so, I suppose my parting recommendation would be to strike now, sort of while the iron is hot and while people are still experiencing some level of outrage about the police violence, and to take, meaningful action toward a criminal justice system that is fair, and that is effective.
Dr. Nellis, thank you so much for joining us here on both sides of the bars. We really appreciate it, and we will have you back, likely, unfortunately, because you may have to put out another report because it's going to take some time to undo this work that you're so invested in, and Fortune Society obviously supports in that way. So we really appreciate it, and we'll have you back. I thank you for giving us your thoughts and observations, and I want to thank all of the viewers for joining us today for this very, very powerful conversation and timely conversation. And in the meantime, on behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you so much for joining us here at both sides of the bars. And if you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, you can go to www.fortunesociety.org to learn more about the work that we do. We're also on Facebook, so you can go there. We're on Instagram. We're also on Twitter. And so my name is Andre Ward, and I thank you so much again for joining us here at both sides of the bars, and continue to view our program.
If you want to know how to reduce crime in America, in New York City, you do it one person at a time, creating an environment that celebrates the human spirit. Recidivism is a result of societal failure to do that, and Fortune has demonstrated that lives can change.
I tell people all the time, this is where I grew up. This is where I learned what being a man is and what being a productive citizen means.
It is the work of this great organization that has helped to shape my ideas, drive my conviction, and further deepen my commitment to the cause.
For more than half a century, you have amplified the voices of those who are impacted by unfair policies and helped thousands of justice-involved people transform their lives. You have led by example to show how we can help formerly incarcerated individuals come home, rebuild their lives, and contribute to our communities.
Fortune Society is at the forefront of hope and lasting positive change.